Welcome to Wealth and Means. Advice dressed up like hard work. We made it to episode 20.
Each week, we explore ideas that help you pause, reflect, and think more deeply about the opportunities all around you.
It's the perfect mix. A little information, a few stats, some real-world insights, and just enough deep talk to make you feel smarter before your second cup of coffee.
Every week, the surface story tells you what happened, but the deeper story tells you what changed underneath. We begin this 20th episode with what you didn't see in the news, where stability itself starts revealing hidden conditions, where liquidity, security, distribution, and even identity become less permanent and more contingent, where systems designed for predictability are quietly learning to live with uncertainty. Then we shift into Wake Up Ready, mapping the phase we're in, the forces already in motion, and the fragile equilibrium between capital, inflation, debt, and technological acceleration, where the question is no longer whether the system functions, but how much weight it can carry. From there, Knowledge Bomb reframes AI itself, not as a software revolution, but as a force that reshapes the physical world beneath it. Humor Me follows, stepping back to examine rules, incentives, and the strange persistence of invisible hierarchies. Then the greater debate, confronting whether history unfolds through structural inevitability or human choice. And finally, Let's Invent Again, returning to first principles where safety, scale, and infrastructure quietly made modern civilization possible.
A quick thank you to our sponsor, Nost Moments at nostmoments.io. Share your most precious memories. Share the Nost Moments. Let's start off with what you didn't see in the news. The quiet story this week isn't what broke, it's what bent. Systems designed to look smooth under normal conditions are suddenly revealing friction when tested. And nowhere is that clearer than private credit, where the illusion of daily stability met the reality of quarterly exits. Blue Owl Capital's semi-liquid credit fund recently hit its redemption limits, forcing it to sell about $1.4 billion in loans, roughly a third of that portfolio to generate cash. Meanwhile, secondary buyers are offering to purchase fund shares at discounts of 12 to 15% below their stated value. The number on paper says $10. The number in cash says $8.50. The significance isn't the markdown, it's the mismatch. These funds were marketed as stable alternatives to public markets. But stability only exists if investors don't all head for the exit at once. The moment liquidity becomes conditional, valuation becomes theoretical. And this surfaced now because rising rates and tighter financial conditions are forcing investors to test assumptions that only held in zero-rate environments.
It's the financial equivalent of finding out your instant access savings account actually means instant within reasonable constraints.
Exactly. And that same theme, assumptions breaking under stress, shows up in policy, where the legal foundation of tariffs just shifted in a way most people missed. A Supreme Court decision on February 20th struck down the use of emergency powers to impose broad tariffs. The conversation immediately pivoted to Section 122 of the Trade Act, which allows temporary tariffs of up to 15%, but only for 150 days at a time. That turns tariffs from permanent fixtures into rolling, renewable windows. Instead of a static wall, you now have something closer to a pulse, on, off, renewed, contested. The downstream effect is operational. Importers are scrambling to restructure customs workflows to track eligibility windows and pursue refunds if tariffs lapse. Legal firms specializing in trade arbitration are seeing a surge in demand. This suddenly matters because supply chains can tolerate predictable costs. They struggle with unpredictable ones. A temporary tariff is less about price and more about uncertainty. And uncertainty, as we'll see, is becoming the defining characteristic of modern infrastructure, from finance to software.
So the system isn't necessarily more expensive, it's more conditional.
Right? And conditional systems are harder to optimize around. Which brings us to software, where attackers are increasingly exploiting trust relationships rather than breaking through defenses directly. A new class of malware is emerging that spreads not by guessing passwords, but by hijacking OAuth tokens, the permissions that apps use to talk to each other. Once inside a single connected app, malicious code can propagate laterally through an entire enterprise using legitimate access channels. It doesn't log in, it already belongs. This matters because traditional cybersecurity is built around perimeter defense, detecting unauthorized entry. But worms operating through authorized tokens look like normal activity. This story surfaced this week as security researchers documented a growing number of these SaaS to SaaS propagation attacks across corporate environments. And the deeper implication is structural. The more interconnected software becomes, the less meaningful the idea of a perimeter becomes.
It's like the difference between someone breaking into your house and someone being handed your house keys by your own smart doorbell.
Exactly, and AI is accelerating that dynamic, particularly in identity-based attacks. A recent report found AI-assisted cyber attacks are now moving 4 times faster than just a year ago. One emerging technique involves attackers using AI-generated voice clones to impersonate executives in calls to IT help desks, convincing them to reset multi-factor authentication credentials. The breach isn't technical, it's social. The system works exactly as designed. It's the inputs that have changed. What makes this different is speed. These attacks can now scale impersonation with near zero marginal cost. Every voice becomes replicable, every identity becomes portable. And it surfaced this week because enterprises are beginning to see successful incidents using these methods, not just experimental demonstrations. Which raises the question, if identity itself becomes easy to simulate, what becomes the new foundation of trust? That question, interestingly, is being answered on the defensive side by tools that operate at entirely different scale. Conditional, a tool originally developed for semantic code patching, is seeing renewed interest as developers port its logic to Rust ecosystems. Instead of searching for patterns in text, semantic patches understand the logic of code, allowing vulnerabilities to be fixed across tens of thousands of files simultaneously. This isn't editing code, it's editing structure. And that matters because modern code bases have grown too large for manual auditing. Automation is becoming the only viable defense against automated threats. This surfaced now because Rust adoption is accelerating across infrastructure software, forcing organizations to modernize entire code bases at once. And the broader pattern is clear. Offense scales, defense must scale faster.
Which means the advantage goes to whoever automates first.
And that same automation dynamic is reshaping productivity and business development in unexpected places, like Reddit. Marketing teams are increasingly mining Reddit discussions to identify potential customers based on intent signals. Tools now alert companies when users post questions like, "Does anyone know a tool that solves this problem?" creating opportunities for direct engagement at the moment of need. Early adopters report customer acquisition costs dropping by nearly 70% compared to traditional advertising. This matters because it flips the model. Instead of broadcasting messages to everyone, companies are identifying people already searching for solutions. This surfaced this week as new tools enabling this strategy began gaining traction among startups. And it reflects a broader shift. Distribution is moving from interruption to interception. That same shift from centralized platforms to more intentional environments is showing up in community infrastructure. Organizations are increasingly migrating away from public social platforms toward private, sovereign community stacks. Tools offering Discord-like functionality without algorithmic interference or data mining are gaining traction among creators and businesses alike. The motivation isn't just privacy, it's signal quality. Smaller curated communities produce higher trust interactions. This surfaced this week as new infrastructure providers reported strong adoption from companies and creators building owned ecosystems. And the implication is subtle but important. The future of social interaction may be smaller, not larger. That fragmentation dynamic also explains a debate quietly unfolding in productivity software. LibreOffice and OnlyOffice are clashing over document compatibility standards. OnlyOffice prioritizes perfect compatibility with Microsoft's formats. LibreOffice argues this reinforces dependence on proprietary ecosystems. It's not just a technical disagreement, it's a strategic one. Perfect compatibility maximizes convenience today. Independent standards preserve autonomy tomorrow. This surfaced this week as the dispute escalated publicly, reflecting growing awareness of how file formats can shape ecosystem power. And ecosystem power increasingly determines who controls distribution. Nowhere is that clearer than in media, where language itself is becoming less of a barrier. YouTube's global rollout of AI auto-dubbing now allows creators to translate videos into 27 languages while preserving emotional tone and pacing. This transforms a creator with one audience into a creator with many audiences. The implication isn't just reach, it's leverage. Content becomes globally scalable without additional production cost. This surfaced now because creators are beginning to see meaningful viewership growth from dubbed versions of existing videos. And it reinforces a broader shift. Content is no longer constrained by geography.
Which means the limiting factor isn't language anymore, it's originality.
That's why hyperlocal content is simultaneously booming. City-specific explainers covering zoning changes, transit projects, and neighborhood development are attracting growing audiences. These topics require local knowledge that cannot easily be automated or generalized. The appeal isn't scale, it's specificity. This surfaced this week as several hyperlocal creator channels saw rapid growth tied to highly localized reporting. And it suggests that while global distribution is expanding, local relevance remains defensible. That tension between global reach and local reality shows up vividly in housing. A viral Reddit post captured a widespread sentiment. Many workers are earning roughly the same wages they did in 2021, while housing costs have risen significantly. Mortgage rates near 7% have further widened the affordability gap. The result is migration, not necessarily out of necessity but out of arithmetic. People are relocating to smaller cities where income-to-cost ratios remain viable. This surfaced now as affordability constraints persist despite nominal economic growth. And it reinforces a structural shift. Mobility is becoming an economic adaptation mechanism. Even lifestyle trends are reflecting similar recalibrations. Consumers are increasingly paying for curated information, newsletters, private communities, as a way to filter noise. At the same time, fitness trends like weighted walking are gaining popularity because they deliver measurable benefits with minimal complexity. Both reflect the same instinct, efficiency. This surfaced this week as these trends continued gaining adoption among professionals optimizing time and attention. And the deeper pattern is optimization under constraint. Which brings us unexpectedly to Formula One. The upcoming 2026 regulations introduce cars that dynamically adjust aerodynamics depending on track conditions, maximizing downforce in corners and minimizing drag on straights. The engine architecture now splits power evenly between electric and combustion systems. These cars aren't optimized for a single condition, they're optimized for adaptability. And that surfaced this week as teams revealed early engineering details, which mirrors what we're seeing everywhere else. Systems designed not for static environments, but dynamic ones.
The common thread is flexibility replacing permanence.
Exactly. Because across finance, software, media, housing, and engineering, the defining shift isn't collapse, it's conditionality. Liquidity that depends on timing, security that depends on identity, distribution that depends on context. The world isn't becoming less functional, it's becoming less fixed. And the advantage increasingly goes to those who understand not just how systems work, but when they work. Now let's wake up ready. We're shaking up the format for Wake Up Ready. We hope you like it. To understand this week, you have to start with the structural phase we're in. The system is no longer tightening aggressively, but it's not loose either. The Fed has already cut rates by about 75 basis points from the peak and is now holding the federal funds rate in the 3.5 to 3.75% range. They still describe that level as moderately restrictive, which tells you something important. Liquidity is no longer being actively withdrawn, but it's not being freely expanded either. Inflation explains why. Headline CPI has fallen to about 2.4% year over year, and core CPI is around 2.5%. That's a massive improvement from the peak. But the Fed's preferred measure, core PCE, reaccelerated to about 0.4% month over month in December and is running closer to 3% annualized. So inflation is falling, but not cleanly. It's uneven, and that keeps policymakers cautious. At the same time, the real economy hasn't broken. Unemployment is sitting around 4.3 to 4.4%. Payroll growth has slowed into the range of roughly 100 to 150,000 per month, which is enough to maintain stability, but not enough to overheat the system. Income is still growing modestly, consumption is still expanding, and global growth projections for 2026 sit around 3.3%. But the most important structural force isn't monetary policy, it's fiscal policy. The U.S. deficit is projected around $1.8 to $1.9 trillion this year, roughly 5.8% of GDP. That means Treasury issuance is structurally elevated. Markets aren't just pricing inflation or growth, they're pricing supply. They're constantly asking who is going to absorb this debt and at what yield.
And that's a subtle but profound shift. The marginal force in markets isn't just economic performance anymore, it's balance sheet capacity.
Exactly. And layered on top of that is a very unusual subcycle. AI and semiconductor investment is exploding. Hyperscalers alone are expected to spend over $500 billion on AI infrastructure in 2026. That investment is acting like a structural support beam. It's offsetting weakness elsewhere and creating pockets of capital abundance inside a broader environment of capital discipline. So the phase we're in is best understood as late-cycle disinflation, with selective capital abundance and structurally heavy sovereign borrowing. Growth isn't collapsing, inflation isn't solved, liquidity isn't free, everything is conditional. Now let's talk about what's already in motion. The labor market is gradually cooling, but not breaking. Payroll growth has slowed compared to the post-pandemic surge, and unemployment has drifted into the low fours. Wage growth has cooled toward roughly 3.5 to 3.7%. That's enough to ease inflation pressure without triggering a demand shock. Credit markets reflect a similar dynamic. High-yield spreads are sitting around 2.9%. Historically, that's still tight. It means capital is available, but lenders are becoming more selective. Risk isn't being eliminated, it's being priced. At the same time, the fiscal backdrop continues to expand. Public debt, held by the public, is already above 100% of GDP and projected to rise significantly over the coming decade. Interest costs alone are becoming one of the largest federal expenditures. That's a structural shift. It means the Treasury market itself is becoming one of the most important drivers of financial conditions. Meanwhile, AI investment continues accelerating. Spending on data centers, chips, and compute infrastructure is scaling into the hundreds of billions annually. That investment is highly concentrated, but its macro impact is real. It's supporting industrial production, capital goods orders, and corporate earnings in key sectors. Energy adds another layer of complexity. Oil has moved back into the low $70 range, up roughly 10% over the past month, driven more by geopolitical risk than physical scarcity. That matters because energy is one of the fastest channels through which inflation expectations can re-anchor.
So you have this strange coexistence: labor cooling but stable, inflation falling but sticky, credit open but selective, and AI acting like a parallel growth engine.
That's exactly right. It's a system stabilizing, but not yet comfortable. Now we move into the forecast. These are the narrative tests that will determine whether the trajectory holds. Treasury auctions are one of the most important events this week. When the government issues new debt, investors submit bids. If demand is strong, yields stay stable. If demand is weak, yields rise. This week's auctions will test whether markets can continue absorbing supply at current levels without requiring higher yields. GDP revisions also arrive, refining the estimate of fourth quarter growth. The advance estimate showed growth slowing to about 1.4% annualized. If revisions move lower, it reinforces the cooling narrative. If they move higher, it reinforces resilience and potentially delays further rate cuts. Labor data continues to matter enormously. Jobless claims and revisions help determine whether unemployment is stabilizing or beginning to rise more meaningfully. The unemployment rate around 4.3% is consistent with normalization. But if it begins moving toward 4.5% or higher quickly, markets will start repricing recession risk. The most important corporate signal comes from NVIDIA. Their earnings aren't just about one company, they're a proxy for global AI investment. If NVIDIA reports strong demand and guidance, it reinforces the idea that AI capex can continue supporting growth. If guidance weakens, it undermines one of the system's primary structural supports. Energy markets remain another real-time test. Any escalation in Middle East tensions that disrupts oil flows could push prices significantly higher. Oil moving from the low 70s toward the 80s would immediately complicate the inflation outlook and central bank policy.
So this week is less about surprises and more about confirmation. Are the stabilizing forces still intact?
Correct. And that leads directly into the fragilities. Treasury auctions are one of the clearest fragility points. If auctions begin clearing at yields meaningfully above expectations, what traders call tails, it signals weakening demand. That forces yields higher, which tightens financial conditions across mortgages, corporate debt, and equities. Credit spreads are another critical signal. If high-yield spreads widen sharply from around 2.9% toward 4 or 5%, it indicates lenders are becoming more defensive. That's how capital discipline turns into credit contraction. Labor remains the most politically and economically sensitive variable. A rise in unemployment from roughly 4.3% toward 4.7 or 5% would fundamentally change the narrative. It would signal that cooling has turned into deterioration. Energy represents the fastest fragility channel. Oil rising rapidly into the $80 or $90 range due to physical disruption, not just headlines, would push inflation expectations higher and delay policy easing. And AI investment itself is a fragility point. If hyperscalers or chipmakers signal reduced capital spending plans, it removes one of the system's key growth engines.
It's almost paradoxical. The same forces holding the system up are also the ones capable of destabilizing it if they reverse.
That's exactly how late-cycle environments work. Strength and fragility coexist. Now let's move to the break signals, the warnings that would indicate a deeper structural shift. Repeated weak Treasury auctions would signal the market is reaching its absorption limit. That would push yields higher structurally, not temporarily. A sharp widening in credit spreads would signal risk repricing. That's how liquidity tightening spreads beyond government bonds into the real economy. A sudden jump in unemployment would signal demand deterioration, not normalization. An energy shock would force central banks to prioritize inflation control over growth stabilization. And a significant pullback in AI investment would remove one of the most important structural supports underpinning growth expectations. These are the signals that tell you the system is changing, not just fluctuating. And finally, the shadow calendar, the hidden forces shaping outcomes beneath the surface. Treasury issuance itself creates mechanical pressure on markets. Even when auctions go smoothly, they require balance sheet capacity. Dealers absorb supply, hedge risk, and redistribute exposure. That process influences yields and financial conditions after the event itself. Positioning around major technology earnings also creates mechanical volatility. When companies like NVIDIA report, hedging flows and positioning adjustments can amplify moves beyond what fundamentals alone would imply. Energy shipping patterns and insurance costs often shift before prices fully react. Those operational changes can signal tightening supply before it becomes visible in official data. And central bank communication continues shaping expectations quietly. Even without policy changes, speeches and guidance influence how markets price the future path of liquidity.
So the deeper message is that macro isn't just about the visible events, it's about the system's capacity to absorb them.
And right now, that capacity still exists, but it's being tested constantly. We're in a late cycle stabilization phase. Inflation has fallen from crisis levels but hasn't fully settled. Growth has slowed but remains intact. Credit is available but selective, fiscal issuance is elevated, and AI investment is providing concentrated structural support. The trajectory is stable but conditional. The events this week, auctions, labor data, earnings, and energy developments, aren't just data points, they're stress tests. And the signals to watch aren't just outcomes, they're absorption, demand, capacity. Because in this phase of the cycle, the most important question isn't whether the system is strong. It's whether the system can continue carrying its own weight. That's Wake Up Ready, not just what happens, but what it means when it happens.
All right, knowledge bomb. If you want to understand where AI is going, stop looking at software. Start looking at gravity. Because AI has a native environment. It thrives in anything that can be reduced to a 1 or a 0. Code, text, contracts, financial models, middlemen, anything symbolic, anything abstract, anything that lives purely as information. That's where AI moves fastest. That's where it compresses entire professions into a function call. But gravity weakens when AI hits atoms. AI can design a bridge, but it cannot pour concrete. It can optimize a power grid, but it cannot generate electricity without turbines. It can recommend surgery, but it cannot hold a scalpel and carry legal accountability for the outcome. The physical world imposes constraints that software cannot bypass. This creates what you might call the analog fortress. These are industries whose value isn't stored in code. It's stored in land, infrastructure, regulation, and physical necessity. Quarries, power plants, waste systems, medical hardware, pipelines, railroads. The unglamorous backbone of civilization, carpets, painted walls, roads, and tires. And here's the inversion most people miss. AI doesn't weaken these industries. It strengthens them. Because AI is not just intelligence, it's an energy conversion process. Every model consumes electricity. Every data center consumes land, concrete, copper, and cooling. The smarter the machines get, the more physical infrastructure they require to exist. The digital economy floats on top of an analog foundation, which means the real bottleneck isn't intelligence, it's power, it's materials, it's infrastructure, it's atoms. And this leads to a simple but profound investment principle. In a world where intelligence becomes abundant, scarcity moves to the physical layer. The winners aren't just the companies building AI. They're the ones building the world AI has no choice but to live inside. And that's your knowledge bomb.
Okay, humor me for a second. Ever since Ray Dalio told us the world order has broken down and we were returning to the law of the jungle, there's a quiet realization happening among adults right now. Modern life isn't governed by logic. It's governed by something much older. Something closer to the Jungle Book. Because if you revisit the Jungle Book as an adult, you realize it's not a children's story. It's a compliance manual. The laws of the jungle are very clear. You don't hunt near the watering hole. You don't kill for sport. You respect territory. You follow the pack. And most importantly, you never forget your place in the order. And as a kid, you think, that's nice, structure, community, mutual respect. As an adult, you realize this is just corporate governance with better branding. The watering hole is the weekly team meeting. Territory is your job description. And the law of the jungle is that strange, invisible agreement that everyone pretends makes sense, even when nobody remembers who invented it. My favorite character, by the way, is Baloo. Baloo is the middle manager. Baloo's entire philosophy is follow the rules, trust the system, and everything will work out. Baloo has never seen the quarterly numbers. Baloo has never met the shareholders. But Baloo believes, deeply. Then there's Bagheera. Bagheera is senior leadership. Calm, strategic, slightly ominous. Bagheera doesn't explain the rules. Bagheera enforces the rules. Bagheera says things like, this is the way things are, which is corporate for, I don't make the jungle, I just bill for it. And then there's Shere Khan. Shere Khan is the market. Shere Khan does not care about the rules. Shere Khan does not attend alignment meetings. Shere Khan is a tiger, and the tiger's core management philosophy is very simple. Incentives eat structure. You can have all the rules you want, all the process, all the hierarchy, but when incentives change, the jungle reorganizes instantly. And the most important character in the whole story is Mowgli, because Mowgli is the outsider, the human, the one creature not born into the rules. Which means Mowgli is the only one who can question them. Mowgli doesn't ask, "What are the rules?" Mowgli asks, "Why are these the rules?" Which, incidentally, is the most dangerous question you can ask in any system. Because once you realize most rules were created for conditions that no longer exist, you gain a kind of optionality. You stop confusing tradition with optimization. You start seeing that some rules protect stability and others protect incumbents. And this explains a lot of modern professional behavior. For example, have you ever noticed that the people who most aggressively defend the rules are usually the ones who benefit most from the rules? It's never the gazelle saying we must preserve the integrity of the food chain. That's never the gazelle's position. And occasionally, the jungle updates its rules, usually after a crisis, usually after Shere Khan eats someone important. Then suddenly, there's a task force, a new framework, a revised compliance structure. Everyone agrees lessons have been learned, until the next tiger shows up. Which is why the real lesson of the Jungle Book isn't that rules are bad, it's that rules are adaptive, temporary, negotiated between power, incentives, and survival. The animals who thrive aren't the ones who memorize the rules. They're the ones who understand why the rules exist in the first place. Because markets are jungles, companies are jungles, even portfolios are jungles. And the investors who survive the longest aren't the strongest or the fastest. They're the ones who can tell the difference between the law of the jungle and the moment the jungle quietly changes its mind.
And now for the greater debate. This is the debate that quietly reorganizes dinner tables. It starts innocently enough. Someone says the world feels unstable. Someone else nods. Someone invokes history, cycles, patterns. And before long, you realize you're not talking about markets or treaties. You're talking about whether history is something we ride or something we write. Tonight, the question is deceptively simple. Is the breakdown of the world order an inevitable phase of a historical cycle, or the result of specific human choices that could have gone differently? At the left lectern stands Ray Dalio, investor, system builder, student of long-term patterns. His worldview is structural. He believes that nations rise and fall through recurring cycles driven by debt, power, and internal cohesion. To Dalio, disorder isn't surprising. It's overdue. What we're living through now isn't an anomaly. It's stage 6. At the right lectern stands Tunku Varadarajan, journalist, jurist, classical liberal thinker. His worldview is humanistic. He believes history is shaped less by cycles and more by decisions, by leaders, institutions, and the moral frameworks they choose to defend or abandon. To Varadarajan, disorder isn't inevitable. It's contingent. Dalio begins with calm inevitability. His voice carries the confidence of someone who has watched systems unfold over decades. He argues that what we call the post-1945 order was never permanent. It was an arrangement sustained by a single dominant power, the United States, whose economic strength, military capacity, and institutional legitimacy allowed it to set the rules. But no power maintains dominance forever. Debt accumulates, internal divisions grow, rivals emerge, and when relative power equalizes, the system destabilizes. This isn't ideology, he insists. It's physics. Empires don't collapse because they want to. They collapse because their inputs no longer sustain their outputs. He gestures metaphorically across centuries. The Dutch yielded to the British yielded to the Americans, and now, he argues, the Americans are yielding gradually, unevenly to China. Not because of moral failure, but because of arithmetic. China produces more engineers, manufactures more goods, controls more supply chains, builds faster, saves more. These are measurable forces. The world order doesn't break when someone declares it broken. It breaks when the underlying power structure shifts beyond repair. There's a murmur in the room. The argument is unsettling but coherent. Varadarajan responds without urgency. His voice is precise, almost surgical. He concedes the patterns Dalio describes. Yes, powers rise and fall. Yes, economic strength matters. But he rejects the premise that this process unfolds with mechanical inevitability. History, he says, is not governed by gravity. It is governed by judgment. He points out that the post-war order was not simply a byproduct of American strength. It was a deliberate construction. The United States chose restraint when it could have chosen domination. It built institutions that constrained its own power. It tolerated dissent. It allowed weaker nations to prosper without annexation. These were not structurally necessary choices. They were moral and political ones. And he leans in the implication. If order was built by choice, it can be preserved by choice. And if it collapses, it is not because a clock ran out, it is because leaders failed to defend it. There's a pause. The audience feels the distinction. Dalio describes systems. Varadarajan describes responsibility. Dalio returns, and this time he sharpens his point. He argues that moral framing, while important, does not override material constraints. A nation cannot preserve order if it lacks the capacity to enforce it. Institutions are downstream of power. Treaties are downstream of enforcement. When relative strength erodes, legitimacy follows. This isn't cynicism, he insists. It's observation. The League of Nations did not fail because it lacked virtue. It failed because it lacked force. And he pushes further. He warns against the illusion that good intentions can substitute for strategic reality. When rising powers believe the existing system no longer reflects their strength, they challenge it, not out of malice, but out of incentive. Stability depends on alignment between perceived power and institutional authority. When those diverge, conflict emerges. The room grows quieter, the logic feels difficult to escape. Varadarajan responds, and this time there is steel beneath the calm. He argues that Dalio's framework risks collapsing critical distinctions. Not all powers are interchangeable. Not all systems are morally equivalent. A liberal democracy and an authoritarian state do not simply represent different points on a power spectrum. They represent fundamentally different relationships between the individual and the state. He warns that describing conflict purely in terms of power risks normalizing aggression. If rising powers inevitably reshape the order, then resistance becomes irrational. Appeasement becomes pragmatic. Principles become optional. And then he lands his first truly destabilizing point. He suggests that Dalio's cyclical model, while analytically elegant, risks becoming psychologically paralyzing. If decline is inevitable, why resist it? If disorder is a stage, why prevent it? A theory intended to explain history may inadvertently discourage those who would shape it. There's a visible shift in the room. This is no longer an academic disagreement. It's a question of agency. Dalio doesn't retreat. Instead, he acknowledges the discomfort. He agrees that human choices matter, leadership matters. But he insists those choices operate within constraints. Leaders cannot choose outcomes that their resources cannot sustain. They cannot preserve dominance while accumulating unsustainable debt. They cannot maintain unity while tolerating fragmentation. Structural forces don't eliminate agency, but they bound it. And he offers a quiet warning. The greatest danger, he suggests, is denial. Civilizations often believe themselves exempt from the patterns that governed their predecessors. They interpret decline as temporary, reversible, exceptional. By the time they accept reality, their options have narrowed. Varadarajan nods slightly, and then he offers his most intellectually honest concession. He acknowledges that structural forces are real. Economic weakness limits strategic flexibility. Internal division weakens deterrence. No society operates entirely outside material constraints. But he refuses the conclusion that those constraints dictate destiny. He reminds the audience that societies have reversed decline before, through reform, through renewal, through leadership willing to confront uncomfortable truths rather than rationalize them as inevitabilities. He argues that cyclical models describe tendencies, not outcomes. They illuminate risk. They do not eliminate possibility. The debate slows now, not because either side has weakened, but because both have clarified the terrain. Dalio believes systems dominate individuals. Varadarajan believes individuals at rare and critical moments dominate systems. Dalio sees history as a tide. Varadarajan sees it as a helm. Neither denies the existence of the other. And the audience sits there, suspended between comfort and responsibility. Because Dalio offers explanation, but Varadarjan offers accountability. If decline is structural, it may be unavoidable. If decline is chosen, it may be reversible. And that is the greater debate.
Let's invent again. Imagine stepping into a 19th century factory, the air thick with coal dust and the relentless hum of machinery. Steam engines are the beating heart of industry, but they're also ticking bombs. Boiler explosions are terrifyingly common, shells of metal ripping apart, scalding water, and shrapnel claiming lives in an instant. In 1857, right in the heart of New York City, the Hague Street explosion killed dozens, a stark reminder that progress came with peril. It was in this world of raw ambition and real danger that a young man from a quiet Rhode Island town decided to rethink the fundamentals of steam power. Stephen Wilcox Jr. wasn't born into wealth or academic circles. He came from Westerly, a place known more for granite quarries than groundbreaking ideas, entering the world on February 12, 1830. By all accounts, he was a tinkerer from the start, the kind of kid who took apart clocks and dreamed up machines before he could vote. At just 23, he snagged his first patent for a hot air engine meant to power fog signals in lighthouses. It didn't make him rich, but it lit a fire. Over the years, he'd rack up 47 patents, each one a step toward solving problems others ignored. But it was steam boilers that captured his obsession, especially after witnessing the carnage they could cause. Wilcox saw the flaw in the dominant design, fire tube boilers, where hot gases snaked through tubes immersed in a massive vat of water. Heat the whole thing wrong, and the pressure built until the shell burst like an overripe fruit. Lives were lost, factories leveled. Why not flip it? Put the water inside the tubes and let the fire rage around them. That way, if a tube failed, it was contained. No catastrophic blast. In 1856, he patented his first version, a safety water tube boiler with inclined tubes to promote circulation and prevent buildup. It was clever, but imperfect. He needed a partner to refine it, someone with complementary skills in manufacturing and business. Enter George Herman Babcock, a fellow Rhode Islander with a knack for precision engineering. The two met through mutual circles, bonded over shared frustration with outdated tech, and by 1867, they'd perfected the design. Their patent described a steam generator where water flowed through a network of tubes, heated externally, allowing for safer operation and higher pressures. It wasn't just safer, it was smarter. The inclined tubes ensured natural circulation, hot water rising, cooler sinking, without pumps, reducing complexity and failure points. But ideas alone don't change the world. Execution does. Wilcox and Babcock, along with investor Joseph P. Manton, founded Babcock, Wilcox and Company that same year in Providence. They bet everything on this boiler, marketing it as the antidote to the era's deadly inefficiencies. Skeptics abounded. Engineers wedded to old ways dismissed it as unproven. Why mess with what worked, even if worked meant occasional disasters? Yet, the duo persisted, iterating through doubts and early setbacks. Their boiler's core insight was dispersion. By breaking the water into smaller volumes across tubes, they minimized risk while maximizing heat transfer. Surfaces exposed to fire were larger, efficiency soared, and pressures could climb without courting explosion. It was a mental model shift, from containing chaos in one big pot to channeling it through a controlled web. The impact rippled out faster than steam from a valve. By the 1880s, their boilers powered the world's first installed utility plant, feeding electricity to cities hungry for light and power. In 1902, they drove New York City's inaugural subway line, a subterranean marvel that reshaped urban life. Factories scaled up production without the shadow of sudden death. Ships crossed oceans with reliable propulsion. The U.S. Navy adopted them for warships, a partnership that endures. During World War I and II, Babcock and Wilcox boilers became synonymous with industrial might, enabling pulverized coal plants in 1918 that burned fuel more cleanly and completely. By mid-century, they'd pioneered supercritical pressure boilers in 1957, operating beyond water's critical point for even greater efficiency, and supplied components for the USS Nautilus, the first nuclear submarine. What started as a safety fix unlocked high temperature, high pressure systems that birthed modern electricity grids. Without it, the electrification of America and the world might have stalled, riddled with accidents and inefficiencies. Concrete consequences: an estimated 30,000 lives saved from boiler blasts alone, plus the economic boom from reliable power. Industries that once limped along with downtime and repairs now hummed steadily, compounding productivity in ways that echoed through markets. Fast forward to today, and Wilcox's echo is everywhere in our energy landscape. Water tube boilers remain the backbone of power generation, handling the brutal demands of thermal plants, chemical refineries, and even renewable setups. In a world chasing net zero, they're adapted for biomass and waste-to-energy systems, turning organic refuse into steam without the fossil fuel hangover. Think about nuclear reactors or concentrated solar power. High-pressure steam cycles owe a debt to that 1867 patent. The company's descendant, now Babcock and Wilcox in Akron, Ohio, leads in clean energy tech, from carbon capture to advanced environmental controls. But the relevance isn't just hardware, it's the pattern. Innovation often springs from misalignment with the status quo, from spotting dangers others normalize. Wilcox didn't invent steam, he tamed it by questioning assumptions. In our era of AI, EVs, and biotech, the same holds. Breakthroughs come when builders address overlooked risks like data privacy in tech or supply chain vulnerabilities in manufacturing. Partnerships matter too. Wilcox's solo tinkering needed Babcock's polish to scale. Modern founders take note, solo geniuses are rare. Durable impact demands teams that complement weaknesses. And consider incentives. The 19th century's industrial race rewarded reliability over flash, much like today's investors prize resilient models amid volatility. Wilcox died in 1893, just 19 days before Babcock, but their company outlived them, a testament to building for longevity. Here's the resonant lesson. True progress isn't about chasing hype, it's about fixing the fragile foundations that hold everything up. In a time when startups pivot quarterly and markets swing on sentiment, remember Wilcox. Innovation compounds when you align human ingenuity with enduring needs. It turns peril into power and echoes across centuries. That's it for another episode of Wealth and Means, advice dressed up like hard work.
We hope you enjoyed the arc. What emerges is a portrait of a world shifting from certainty to contingency, from permanence to probability, from fixed foundations to flexible frameworks. Systems endure not because they are static, but because they adapt, because builders balance risk with resilience, because progress favors those who understand structure beneath the surface. In markets, in machines, and in moments of change, durability comes from disciplined design, patient preparation, and the quiet mastery of first principles.
Subscribe, rate, and share this episode. It helps more than you think.
We do this for you to help you have a better week, a sharper mind, and maybe even a longer attention span.
And a special thanks to our sponsor, Nost Moments, because the best investments are still your memories.
Until next time, stay curious.
Stay kind.
And keep compounding